Welcome to Cassandra's Box, episode 3. This is also going to be about mental illness. Specifically, it's going to be about male obsession, sexual narcissism, and BPD and vulnerable narcissism. And it's actually really important, I think, that we all, first of all, I'll say that I definitely simplified things in my last one. And I kind of did that on purpose as a basic kind of overview. And also to not talk about the fact that, there's many, beyond cluster B personality disorders, there's many others. Those are the ones that are mainly responsible for what's going on right now. There's many other mental illnesses that are playing a role here. And then there's, for example, the differential diagnosis between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder is still under discussion. With some people saying that there's, robust evidence that there are two different conditions, and other people being not so sure and thinking that BPD is on the bipolar spectrum. So again, there's a lot of discussion about these things within the community. But I want to point out that it's a little bit important to distinguish, I think, between grandiose narcissism, vulnerable narcissism, and BPD. Why? And then also and also with like some OCD, and then sometimes we see erotomania, OCD, and sort of stalking behavior. And then why am I talking about? Well, let's distinguish these things, because we need to understand what these TRAs are like and who they are. You've got your grandiose narcissists, right? You've got your TRAs that think they are God's gift. Honestly, someone like Ellie Ehrlich, for example, the spectacular groomer, and I would guess malignant narcissist. Malignant or grandiose narcissist who's incredibly good at grooming. And I'm going to do an episode about grooming soon and what it means, because the people that are really good at grooming, they put an immense amount of energy into it, and they can groom whole communities, and that's really important to what's happening right now. And again, I'm making this and talking about my own experience, and I'm coming to this as an ambassador of the mentally ill, because I'm in this, and I understand this because I've known a lot of these people, and I also understand somewhat their disordered thinking. And it could be really, really difficult when you have disordered thinking, trying to and when there is societal discrimination against people with mental illness and disordered thinking, it can be really difficult. Like, is this an injustice happening right now? What's the point between how to treat others well and how to stand up for yourself and your rights? Especially since there's a lot of prejudice against you, and because you're more likely to be taken advantage of. It's really hard to know, but it's also really hard to know, like, when are you just hurting others and not seeing others, and reflection on yourself in that sense. It can be very difficult to know. So I really understand and empathize on that point. But it's really it's important to understand the difference here. And so grandiose narcissists think that they're God's gift. I would say that somebody it kind of strikes me that people like Rachel McKinnon might also be another one, / Veronica Ivy, but could be a vulnerable narcissist. Depends on how much they play the victim card. I'm not quite sure. And I can sound flippant, play the victim card, but if you're using it as a way of, if it's part of your false self-identity that you're presenting in order to manipulate, and I'm not saying these people are doing this consciously. That's the whole point of the false self, is that there's a kind of splitting of the self that goes on. And again, people talk about the slip of the mask with psychopaths and with narcissists. With psychopaths, that's really true, because psychopaths, sometimes they will let the mask slip on purpose because they get a kick out of, in a sense, like showing someone else who they are because it so unnerves them. And there's a little sadistic thrill in that. And it's also a way of like showing like, nah, 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 I got away with it, right? The duper's delight smirk, which I have definitely seen. And also like an element of like bragging, but most of the time, so there might be a mask slip, and there might be a deliberate removal of the mask, rather than just a slip, and they're aware, psychopaths, but narcissists, I think they both are and aren't aware. And that's because they both are and aren't themselves. That's the point. They have a false self that they present, and the true self. There's one side of the true self that's just monstrous, because it's become sadistic, out of I would say resentment, and a kind of a childlike glee and malice and hurting others, when feeling resentful or rejected. And the other side of that is, the feelings of deep shame that characterize a narcissist at their core. And on top of that is this, carefully constructed false self. And the rest of it is something that can never really be acknowledged to oneself for the narcissist or come to light. Because in order to be acknowledged, first of all, the narcissist would have to acknowledge how much they've hurt others, and they'd also have to acknowledge that they're not the greatest, and they'd have to acknowledge that they're incredibly insecure and ashamed. And these are not things that anyone wants to acknowledge, but they're not some things that the narcissist is capable of acknowledging. So, not without some kind of incredible breakthrough. And so to understand what types of narcissists they are is really important, because you've got your like really, really sinister groomers, right? And you've got your vulnerable narcissists, which I think are a lot of them, which are so essentially grandiose narcissists tend to have they're extroverted, and they have a very false high self-esteem is how they present, right? And what they have convinced themselves that they believe in. And then the other side is the vulnerable narcissist, which extremely neurotic, high on the scale of neuroticism, and tends to be socially awkward and introverted. And they come across as a victim, and oftentimes are misdiagnosed with a mood disorder of some type because of their neuroticism. So, they oftentimes are not diagnosed because they're also good at manipulating. But the hallmark, the diagnostic criteria that overlap, the key diagnostic criteria, are the arrogance, the entitlement, the manipulativeness, and the lack of empathy. And so those are, and the narcissistic rage. And so vulnerable narcissists are more likely to sexually offend. Recent studies have shown, even than grandiose narcissists, which to me is really, really interesting. It shows how much the feelings of rejection, which would go more along with vulnerable narcissism, have to do with that kind of sexual abuse. But at the same time, it's interesting because even in someone like Donald Trump, you can see both in him. And, I've known people that seem to cycle between both. And there's, supposedly grandiose narcissism is produced by spoiling, and then vulnerable narcissism is produced by punishment. And again, I think that there seems to be a lot of overlap and sort of cycling present, and there's still vulnerable narcissism is still being studied right now. And as far as I know, it has not yet been added to the DSM. It's just being, even though it has its own assessment scale, it just hasn't yet been added and still being sort of under discussion. But it's very similar to BPD, and as far as I can see, it's actually quite like BPD, but it has the sexual narcissism component in it. And as I talked about in my last podcast, men are really groomed by the culture into sexual narcissism. Pornography is the existence and tolerance of pornography itself even is simply evidence that our society has always been sending these messages to men more undercover, and it's now just coming out of the open. So I would say that these meta messages are now turning into official messages, in terms of the way it's gone public. But the really gonzo stuff, it's always been out there, but again, it's being pushed into the mainstream because of the Pavlovian conditioning and how people get into the harder and harder stuff. They're conditioning themselves into the sexual narcissism by watching it. But even the fact that it exists and is, it shows that this is something that's been tacitly tolerated and even condoned by society. And then what's interesting about that is that you have the whole philosopher king's idea of someone like Aristotle. It goes back a really long way, which is the observation that that positions of power attract psychopaths and narcissists. And so then what you have is that you have these people with pathological views and values who are making rules and essentially, producing cultural artifacts and disseminating culture to people who are not pathological. Because they cannot, sometimes they can do that, directly by just having a tyranny. And people, because of the groupthink and people going the psychological mechanism whereby people will do things as authority figures tell them, they are able to get a lot of people to go along with this. So it can happen openly, but it tends to happen more undercover. And which is to say that societies themselves are based around cognitive dissonance, and societies themselves are narcissistic in their model, which is to say that you have a cover story, which is the false self of the society. For example, rape is the worst crime you can commit, and it's really terrible. And those people are violent perverts and the most horrible criminals. Or we are a society that, or men should be, good men don't hit women, and good men respect women, and good men are providers, and there's and they have integrity, or the idea that of this romantic and courtly love as being a norm of men of actually looking after women, and that's men's job is to to love and look after women and so on. Some of it might be sort of benevolence and sexism, but the malevolent is all kind of below the surface, the hostile sexism. So that's the point. I mean, look at all those messages, right? But then below the surface you have the true message, which is rape culture. And that is, pushing men into sexual violence. And you have the true message, which is about hurting women. And you have the true messages about using women. And that are the opposite. And that's just one example. But, I mean, all the way down, you have all these messages from politics about your civic duty. Meanwhile, your civil servants don't follow any sort of civic duty in themselves. I mean, the people right now who are being scapegoated as responsible for Trump, have been. I mean, essentially the MAGA people are like kind of like ISIS or the Taliban. You have American imperialism, which goes in there and trains the people who would become the Taliban to fight the Russians, and promises them to help their country and financially help them rebuild after the war, and then does jack shit and pulls out and leaves them in absolute destitution. It's not a mistake that they attacked the financial capital of the world, the center of trade and commerce, by attacking the World Trade Center. And I'm not saying that was a good thing at all, but I'm saying that we created them. We literally created them. We being the United States government. And then if you look at someone like ISIS, we use that as an excuse to say that this was from people in Iraq that were radicalized under Saddam Hussein, and there were weapons of mass destruction there, and we went in there, and so on. This was all, a big lie in order to carve up their country for profit. And we created, and that ended up resulting in the vacuum of power after that. And ended up resulting in all these insurgents and this radicalization, and it resulted in ISIS. And so, and now we can turn around and talk about how they're the most horrible people in the world, as if we had nothing to do with their creation. And so that's what's happening, with the MAGA people. Reaganomics created them. And now we're acting like whiteness created them, like Nancy Pelosi. Whiteness caused the attack on the Capitol, and we're acting like they're just evil anti-maskers, who just don't give a shit about other people. They've been literally, their community is going to be decimated because they're mostly working class, by COVID, and by the financial consequences of COVID as well. This is not in their best interest in any way, shape, or form. Who's politicized masking? Not them. And in fact, I feel kind of sorry for them, because they sensed that something was wrong with Washington, so they wanted to go for a Washington outsider, but it was like a person who leaves an abusive relationship and then gets in a relationship with another abuser. They got, they elected someone who was supposed to drain the swamp, and he was just exactly a poster child for something like Reaganomics. Someone who is, the whole corporate welfare, someone who was bailed out again and again, and somehow was always able to come back after his multiple bankruptcies and, racketeering charges and all the fraud and so on that was going on. He's just a poster child of corporate welfare, and the very opposite of the kind of person they should have been electing. But because they've been told that that's what they should aspire to, and that those people are their friends, not their enemies. Of course they went from, they were gaslit this whole time, but they recognized they had to get away, and then they went for someone who was exactly the same, another abuser, because they're an abused population, because they were weaponized against the working class people of color. Again, deliberately, with the whole image of the welfare queen being black and so on, which was all because they wanted to slash social programs and then give corporate welfare to the witch, and also cut their cut their taxes of the wealthy as well. And so, how did they do this? Well, we're cutting social programs because they're being used by these welfare queens who are black people that are stealing your money from your taxes, and that's why we're doing this. And thereby weaponizing this whole population, told them that, immigrants are stealing their jobs, and black people are using all their tax dollars and these social programs, and they're lazy, and so on. They were told all of this in order to make them vote against their own interests by voting for these libertarian fiscal policies. And now we're blaming them, or Democrats are blaming them, and they're blaming whiteness. And of course they're not going to wear masks now. They were called a basket of deplorables, 40 million people, by the person who was supposed to be their civil servant, Hillary Clinton, who was going for that role. How would she have, Of course they're going to give the middle finger when they're asked to wear masks by Biden. I mean, what the fuck? So to me, it's like society, and I know that turned into a rant, but the point is that the people at the top are the people in power are the ones that we need to point the finger to here. And oh yeah, cognitive dissonance. They're selling a story that's not true. And they're creating cognitive dissonance on purpose. And some of them may believe their story, and they may people that are, promoting this from on high, they may believe their story, they may believe their own justifications for what they're doing, even though their motivation is different, which again is a very narcissistic type of thing, although it's also a very human type of thing. But, they create this kind of, a society that's built on a model of a false self, in a sense. The false social values. Oh, yes, I was talking about civic duty. They're not even doing their civic duty as civil servants, politicians, and yet they expect us to have, do our civic duty, when they're undermining that at every opportunity, they're undermining the community by constantly. I mean, saying something like whiteness caused the attack on the Capitol is just pitting people, working class people, against each other again. And what could they have done? They could have pointed the finger and said the GOP caused this, which would have been correct. But the thing is that then the finger could have been pointed back at them at that point. Because they also were involved in that. The whole crime bill of 1996 and the super predators and so on, the criminalizing of black men. They were involved in stoking these racial tensions. And because, they were also involved in voting for some of those fiscal policies. So they can't point the finger at the people who are the culprits, because they have to take a share of the blame then. So, of course, they scapegoat. So just as, blacks were scapegoated as the people that were wasting tax dollars in order to, weaponize a whole constituency and get them to vote against their interest, and also, play the attack dog, recruiting them through these lies. Donald Trump represents the lie. He's just the apotheosis of Reaganomics, really. That's what's responsible. But they can't come out and say that. And again, that's what I mean. We're told things that we're supposed to be doing in ways that we're supposed to be, that our leaders aren't doing. Do as I say, not as I do, kind of thing, for the year, but not for me. And at the same time, it's because there's a whole official message, but it's because it's a cover for us as a good society, and then you look behind that and you realize the dysfunction, and you can see that even in our stereotypes. And I'm definitely gonna do at some point about positive stereotypes of masculinity, and the negative stereotypes and the negative realities behind them. Sorry. And same for femininity. So we're normalizing pathology by naming it and calling it something else, and we're giving a good overall message. But it's not. That's the false self that we created, and so the reality is what's really happening behind the scenes, and that's all weirdly subconscious. And so we all have this kind of weird split self in this way. And so it's important to understand, in society, the difference between, first of all, understanding that we all have a weird double consciousness going on here, is important, and to understanding why people are being fooled by this. And then vulnerable narcissists, we need to be able to spot those people. That's the vast majority of these really kind of malignant TRAs, or vulnerable narcissists. There's some grandiose narcissists, or there's some malignant narcissists as well, like someone like Ellie Ehrlich. There's some large-scale groomers. How could I not think of that? Someone like Martine Rothblatt, classic grandiose narcissist, you know, has this like fantasy idea of things that are going to come to pass, and then also has convinced themselves that it's something good, right? And it's literally shaping the world to his liking. It's just incredibly narcissistic, but tells himself that he's justifies it, and calls other people the intolerant ones, and the bigots. So that's an example of a grandiose. And then all of the I don't know, all of the TRAs that argue with people on Twitter, and make GoFundMes and stuff are mostly vulnerable narcissists. But BPD is important to understand because I think quite a few of them have just BPD, and like women with BPD could be helped. So BPD is intense fear of abandonment, even going to extreme measures to avoid real or imagined separation or rejection, pattern of unstable, intense relationships, a pattern of idealization and devaluation, and switching between the two. It's a cartoon way of looking at people, because they're either angels or they're devils. So that's really important because again, it's a fantasy prone persona. And then rapid changes in BPD, rapid changes in self-identity and self-image that include shifting goals and values and seeing yourself as bad or as if you don't exist at all. And so the seeing yourself as bad or as if you don't exist at all, that's already also characteristic of CPTSD. Many things in CPTSD overlap with BPD. But one thing about self-identity here, which is more characteristic of BPD, CPTSD people usually have their pretty solid sense of self-identity. So, for example, if you don't have a solid sense of self-identity, you'll be constantly looking for, people to accept you in a community, and you will be changing your likes and dislikes all the time, depending on your friends. As opposed to instead having your own likes and dislikes and then looking for your community based on that. So that's a little bit different. So in BPD is the search for identity through others, essentially. And then there's periods of stress-related paranoia, loss of contact with reality, impulsive and risky behavior, suicidal threats or behavior of self-injury, often in response to fear of separation or rejection, mood swings, ongoing feelings of emptiness, inappropriate, intense anger, such as frequently losing your temper, being sarcastic or bitter, or having physical fights. This is a lot of these trans rights activists. And the difference is these people could get help. They may also have AGP. Some of them may just have BPD and have stumbled upon this, right? But they may also have AGP. But the point is, there's a lot of people with AGP that also have autism or BPD, or whatever, right? Especially since there's a lot of comorbidities, and yes. So these people can be helped. Women who have this disorder can be helped. Dialectical behavioral therapy helps really, really well. Dialectical behavioral therapy is all about the integration of the self and how to manage strong emotions. And so it's important to understand, that I think that there's a lot of people who are trans who may have BPD and AGP, but they don't have the things that are characteristic of, and they may be pretty nasty even. They may be offensive at least, and maybe nasty at worst, but they don't have the total lack of empathy, and they don't have the narcissistic rage from narcissistic injury, and they don't have the same sexual narcissism. So if they have sexual narcissism, if they have those things, then they're vulnerable narcissists. And those people are much more dangerous, and much more likely to sexually abuse, is the point. and to abuse in general, but also to sexually abuse. So they're dangerous. And then you have the grandiose narcissists, and who may be doing this for some I don't know, some kind of huge personal quest or something. Again, someone like Martine Rothblatt comes to mind. And then, you have someone, a malignant narcissist, which is somebody like, I think, Ellie Ehrlich. And these people can be, very, very good at grooming. And then sexual narcissism. You can have sexual narcissists who are specialists. And I'm going to talk about this when I talk about grooming again. It's really, really interesting studies into sexual narcissism. And I can say that from my personal experiences talking to sexual narcissists, and then listening to the way that men are groomed into sexual narcissism from, listening to people who are have studied the effects of pornography on men who use it compulsively or pathologically. And then, the sexual narcissism of even a full-blown narcissist. To me, that all of that seems to come from sexual narcissism. Maybe I will do a separate post a separate podcast on sexual narcissism itself, rather than just putting it in with grooming, because it is such an interesting topic in and of itself. I think that there's a lot of men. Okay, so men, they believe that the official message, which is causing them their shame. Essentially, the shame that they feel is because the conflict between the meta message and the official message. And now that's what I'm saying. These meta messages are becoming official because we're just now. It's like it's just like a free for all, essentially, of all these fetishists and paraphiliacs. We're just letting it all hang out here. But normally, we didn't. And so there was a sort of, there was a kind of, and yeah, the link between sexual narcissism and some things with liberalism is interesting as well. But there's and not to say that there's not plenty of sexually narcissistic conservatives, but it's interesting how it's sort of championed in this way by movements disguised as free love or sex positivity, or like fun and kinky, like the BDSM movement. That's rebranding as fun and kinky, or like the trans movement, right, as sexual liberation of some type. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, so this kind of so I think that what's happening is that a lot of men feel like it's women's fault. They feel ashamed about their sexuality, and that's why they want to destroy these official messages altogether about things being wrong or harming others. And they think that their true sexuality is this very like pathological one, and they don't realize that the extent to which they have been groomed into that degree of sexual narcissism and that sense of male sexuality. I do not think male sexuality in any way is inherently violent. Has to be inherently violent, and dominating, domineering, controlling. It doesn't have to be, but they feel like that's their innate sexuality because they've been groomed into this. But then they've also been told not to act on it. That's the whole thing. As long as we told you not to act on it, we wash our hands of this. And then the point is that they really are supposed to. I mean, again, it's the crazy making. It's how we pathologize and stigmatize mental illness while causing people to be mentally ill. So the meta messages is rightfully pathologizes the mental illness of biastophilia, for example, which is the paraphilia for wanting to force others into sex. So it's a paraphilia for rape. We rightly, pathologize that, but then we also encourage it. So again, and they think that they blame women for the pathologizing, and they don't realize about the encouraging at all. So even though it's so apparent, and online pornography is just makes it absolutely apparent that this has always existed, because it arrived already. It's not like it slowly got worse. It arrived like bam, it was already in full bloom. All of that gross stuff was already there. It just has become more mainstream because of Pavlovian conditioning and how strong an orgasm is for Pavlovian conditioning, and more normal guys that need to have the stronger and stronger rush. So they're grooming people into this degrees of sexual violence and sexual narcissism. But it was already there. All that stuff has just gone mainstream because of the conditioning now. I'm going to do a separate one about conditioning, but it's all gone there, mainstream now because of that, but it was already there. And so it's been there this whole time. I mean, it's, for millennia, it's always been there. And so it just is, we can just see it now. And it, not only can we see it now, but now it's being embraced, and now it's being normalized. And so essentially, saying the quiet part out loud, society is now doing this as a whole, right? And that actually, I suppose, changing from the narcissist with the false self to the full-blown unapologetic psychopath is a change for society. Not a change in a great direction. But in any case, so sexual narcissism is interesting because of the fact that there can be people who are specialists, which is to say they don't appear to be in other ways. And now that they have, people that are studying this, psychologists, social scientists, psychiatrists, they have now separated sexual narcissism from overall disorder, global narcissism, and I think it's a separate component. That's something somebody can have without having the others, which is how some people can be so good at fooling everyone and maintaining a normal life, except for this one thing. And again, I'll do my impressions of what sexual narcissism is. I'm going to do another kind of segment on that because I have some personal insight into that, as well as some knowledge from having done some reading about it. So it's important, I think, to be able to distinguish, to understand that a lot of people that are being sucked into this may have BPD rather than any form of NPD. And that's important to, I think that my trans roommate was like that. And then it is also important to understand that there are some people, and I also know people like this, that do not have any other at all mental disorder of any kind, apart from perhaps in that case AGP that they mistook for dysphoria. Or in the case of someone who has HSTS, just dysphoria. I do think people with paraphilias tend to be people with obsessions, and so there's more of a link, I think, with paraphilia, whereas I see HSTS transitioning as being more like something like anorexia, developing a kind of body dysmorphia, as well as the social dysphoria as a result of these, horrendous messages from society to these very gender nonconforming young people. And so to me, it doesn't necessarily, it can be comorbid perhaps with depression and stuff like, and sometimes with personality disorders, but I would say more likely with just a mood disorder like depression or with social anxiety or something, than with, a lot of the AGPs who, the AGP is not coming from, any social pressure to which a person who is vulnerable, perhaps they also have depression or autism, may succumb, right? AGP is a paraphilia, and people with paraphilias do have a tendency more often to have mental illnesses or personality disorders, but not all of them do. Okay, and then those that do, they tend to have either BPD, they have vulnerable narcissism, which has all these traits of BPD, but with a layer of narcissism on the top, and it matches the central diagnostic criteria for narcissism, which is why it's included in the narcissistic spectrum. And then you have grandiose narcissism and malignant narcissism, and some of them might even be psychopaths. Okay, so you have all of those people, and then people that are supporting them, again, that are the TRAs that are just men, and some women, but more men, interestingly, gay or straight, that are supporting them. I'm thinking someone like Adrian Harrop, for example, the doctor that Glinner has done a lot of exposés on. He is somebody who strikes me as, he might be someone kind of like, I'm not sure if he's really more of a narcissist, psychopath, or everyday sadist. It's kind of hard to say, but obviously he's somebody who absolutely relishes, and whether he hates women or he just really likes messing with people, and this presents a perfect opportunity. But obviously this whole thing presents perfect opportunity to all sorts of bad actors, right? People who just hate women, people who just want to mess with people, whether they're women or anyone else. So it's hard to know his motivations, but certainly he is also pathological, as many of the most kind of hardcore supporters are. Some of them I think are seriously misguided, but many of them are just, it's an opportunity for them to gleefully be able to either express cruelty or specifically misogyny. But then the question is, why is everybody else going along with it? And so I want to talk a little bit about stalking here for a second. Stalking is characterized by everything that characterizes NPD: rage, resentment, jealousy, quickly falling in love, obsession, not obsession, quickly falling in love, idealization and devaluation, all these other things that characterize stalking, right, that overlap with NPD. Hold on, let's see. Unable to take rejection, entitlement, needs to be in control, depends on others for sense of self. With vulnerable narcissism, you also have socially awkward or uncomfortable, falls instantly in love, deceptive, narcissistic, manipulative, jealous, all of those things. Now, the obsessive and compulsive is a little bit different. And so this could be somebody who has OCD and NPD, but I think that there could be some stalkers that are, for example, autistic, and they have low cognitive empathy, so they don't understand that they're making others uncomfortable necessarily with their repeated behaviors, but they don't actually desire to harm anyone. And they just really don't understand. They have lack of social skills, and they might also have OCD, and they may also have a major crush. And as anyone who's ever had a crush knows, it's not realistic. You're not really seeing that person as a person. It's a kind of shallow, it's an idealization, and rather than seeing a person as a person, which is, again, you're making them into like a little cartoon of something that you want, a projection of your desires, but it's not who they really are. So these are people that get a crush, and then they get a fantasy-based obsession with that person. There's many tropes that are about stalking for love, and they are still considered to be love stories. Twilight, The Notebook, Groundhog Day, so many. Even the show You that was made recently, which was supposed to be lampshading that trope, right? It's showing that stalking is not love. It's a pathological obsession with an idealized object, that the minute it begins to that you then devalue because they disappoint you in some way by being a person, or even if they're not by being a person, the honeymoon phase wears off and you blame them for the fact that that happened. So I mean, if you're like that, right, you devalue people that way. So that show You is lampshading that, but young girls watched it and liked the actor and thought he had a crush on him, and he said he found it very disturbing. And it's because young girls, because they've already had the soul to them that stalking is love. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and both Angel and Spike in that show. So much stalking for love. There's so much talking for love, and then it's even still being done, like that 2016, not too long ago, movie Passengers. You look it up. It's called it's a science fiction romance. It is a horror film. It is about a man who chooses to who develops an obsessive crush and chooses to ruin another person's life in order to manipulatively groom them to be their lover out of a selfish desire not to be alone. It's an understandable desire, but at the same time, it doesn't make this right. And it's choosing this woman after in order to groom her for romantic purposes. It's a horror film, and when she finds that out, she's absolutely horrified. It's not a science fiction romance, and you could have made it a science fiction romance if you had both of their pods malfunction at the same time. And I'm sorry for the spoilers. I should have said spoiler alert first, but you're not missing anything. Trust me. You could have just said, let's have two of these pods, malfunction at the same time. And you could have, in order to have conflict in the movie, have them at first hate each other. Or maybe not hate each other, that's too cliche, but maybe they're not that well suited for each other. And it would be interesting if he had a crush on her. Never mind. But they're not well suited for each other, but then over time their need for companionship overrides their and they're able to come around to kind of consider each other's point of view and slowly fall in love. There's so many other ways that you could have made that into a love story, but that was not a love story. It was a horror film, and it's still called a love story. So my point is that we romanticize this, and we also romanticize abusive relationships. The most obvious one, obviously, is Beauty and the Beast. A beast will become a gentle, kind prince if you just continue to show him kindness, even though you were kidnapped and locked away by the beast. So it's part of the culture. And so I think that part of what's going on is that you have I think that people may very well see someone like Samantha Lux as a woman because they believe in the whole trapped in the wrong body for someone with HSTS, right? They do not see these AGPs as women. And I think everyone feels sorry for them because they look so bizarre, most of them. And most of them are just consumed by this rage at not having been accepted by women. By society in general, but specifically by women. That's very apparent. And that's why they come across as creepy. It's not just because they're a middle-aged man in a bad wig and a dress. And we wouldn't automatically associate men in dresses with being creepy. It's not about us, pathologizing gender non-conforming people. That's not what it's about. It's that we know that men like this. We know what they are. It's not because of the dress. That's the point. We know this is about an obsessive paraphilia. This is not about a gender identity. And so this is like Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear. We are afraid of them for a reason. And we're being told to gaslight ourselves because we're being gaslit by society. And being given a no choice in this and being groomed into it. these poor young people that are just so confused. So yeah, that's why we think they're creepy. We know that we can see that they're consumed with white hot rage toward women. And I think that the people that look at these AGPs, I think they that beclown themselves. I think that they think that there's some pity, and there's some kind of like for somebody who so obviously isn't in any way feminine, as none of those AGPs are. Well, I mean, very few of them, and even the ones that could pass because of their physical features and body and petite body size or whatever, the AGPs are never feminine acting in any way, shape, or form. They're just typical dudes who happen to pass. Whereas there tends to be some kind of childhood femininity in the person that later identifies as a female who's a homosexual transsexual. It's like somebody who would have grown up and become a very feminine kind of gay man, right? So that's not the same with somebody who has someone who has AGP. I don't want to stop this recording. I'm sorry, my battery is running low. I'm going to so please excuse this interruption. I thought I was doing really well on the time here, but I need to let's see, get this battery in here. Okay, sorry for the interruption, but I don't want to redo that whole recording there. Okay. Full disclosure, I'm just kind of was lying in bed and recording this. So, okay. Where was I? Oh, yes. So, those are, they don't see those AGPs as actually being, they don't see them as actually being women, the way that they might in HSTS. So why are they going along with that? I think it's because they see them with pity, and they think this is a person who is not in any way feminine and has no chance of passing. For them to for most of those guys, right? Again, some of them can pass even though they have very male behaviors. But looks-wise, they can pass, and I think that confuses people. But most of them don't, right? And also have their very male behaviors. And most of them show this, like, bizarre sexual fixations and so on. These people that are, I would say that these are the people that have BPD, the people who have NPD of any type, obviously, like, the psychopaths, all of them show some pretty bad behaviors, as well as bizarre behaviors. And also, I would say, you might have autistic AGPs who are kind of will join in, because people do join in to mobs and gangs, right? But it's definitely being led by people with, NPD, and then people with BPD are, can also have some pretty bad behaviors. But again, I think that those people are reachable in therapy because they don't have the hallmark lack of empathy and high entitlement. They do have attention-seeking behavior, but not the high entitlement and the lack of empathy with the narcissistic rage. So they might be able to benefit from something like dialectical behavioral therapy, which has had remarkable success with people with BPD. So again, I think it's the people with NPD and any psychopaths, obviously, that are spearheading the bad behavior here. And then others are sort of kind of joining in the mob. And then, bystanders. Why are the bystanders joining in? I mean, I do think that because essentially society is run, by these types of people, and the rest of normal people are confused by the conflicting messages. Normal people would even go along with the kind of, again, the sort of psychopathic and tyrannical societies that are really violent, usually through use of violence, through state violence, making sure that people cooperate. But it's easier to control people if you give them an official message, right? A cover story for this is our overall, we have actually good beliefs, so you can feel like a good person. But then we're actually pathologizing them by sending all these horrific meta messages, and it's how people in power have always controlled people. You just weaponize people against each other, right? And so people who are neurotypical and who don't desire to act badly in antisocial ways toward others, they resist this to varying degrees, right? But then the whole thing about group, they don't realize that they're not the only ones who feel this way. The whole preference falsification thing, because those controlling the narrative are those who are pathological. And they also, there's the groupthink, and there's the giving into authority, that even people who are neurotypical will do. So all of those things are at play here. And we've got the astroturfing from on high going on by these powerful and pathological individuals. But that's not only it. I think this one specific message, essentially a person who's so obsessed with becoming a woman, again, the woman is an idealized object, just like the idealized object of a stalker, or the idealized object of someone with NPD. People with NPD, or they especially like malignant narcissists, they'll tend to often be abusers, and they might be extremely controlling as well. But another, and I think a lot of psychopaths are like that as well. But another aspect of both NPD and psychopathy, specific to sexual narcissism, is a pattern of short-term relationships, and the cycle of idealize, devalue, discard, and the needing to have relationships, for it's the only time. It's something called the hedonic treadmill. We all have our baseline. You have to, people say your baseline is set for life. I'm not sure if I believe that. I think you can work on, if you have a low baseline, I think you can work on becoming a happier person. I think that's possible. It's just going to take a lot of work. That's going to have to probably be ongoing work. But you're responsible for your own baseline. You cannot use other people to change your baseline, and it will only be a temporary change at most. And that's why these people they feel empty all the time. Their baseline is horrible. They can't stand to be alone, and so they need to have relationships all the time. And whereas people with BPD are characterized by a fear of abandonment, and so will stay in relationships longer term if people will put up with them. People with NPD will tend to cycle through, with sexual narcissism especially, will tend to cycle through relationships really fast. I mean, you can see that with sex addiction and so on, because they're discarding those people. Whereas, this obsession is more like a stalker, which is more like somebody who has like malignant narcissism, is extremely controlling, or perhaps narcissism mixed with obsessive compulsion, and that's the obsessive nature of the stalker, and so this obsessive desire to want to become a woman, and again, I think that there are some people that could have say OCD autism, have the obsessive desire to want to become a woman, but I think for the most part, though, again, I think with autism, there's some difficulty. There can be difficulty in perceiving others as being people, and I think yes, this idea of woman, it's similar to stalkers. It's like stalking this notion of the true or idealized self in the form of a woman. And so of course there's like this immense resentment against women who say no, not against the men who attack them or put them down or whatever. Women who say no, and because that's rejection. As women, they need to say yes. And I think overall, part of patriarchy is this intense desire to intrude upon the woman because, in some ways, hierarchy itself is about narcissism because there's the false self of power, right? It relies upon, and in fact, I will I'm going to read a